Welcome to Emerging Civil War. I'm Chris Mackowski, and I am delighted to have with me today Harold Holzer, the Dean of Lincoln Scholars, joining us today. Harold, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us.
Thank you. By Dean, I'm sure you mean the oldest. I think I qualify. So on that count. So thanks.
I would even go so far as to say the provost. I mean, we'll put you right up there. Most of our readers and viewers and listeners know you as the premier Lincoln scholar in the country, but you've got a new book out that really kind of looks at the presidency in a much broader lens. But you actually have a background in politics and journalism, so this is actually a pretty natural step for you. Tell me a little bit about that background, please.
So, my background before I became the dean when I was a kid. I chuckle at that because when I was starting in the field, there were two deans of Lincoln Scholarship. They were the same age, and they were a little bit competitive, Don Fehrenbacher and Richard Nelson Current. So they were the co-deans. No one ever, thought to choose between them. Don died, I think he was around 80. And so Dick Current became the dean, and he lived to 100.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. And so now the deanship is up for grabs, really. Anyway, so as you probably remember, I wrote a book called Lincoln and the Power of the Press 5 years ago that kind of combined my Lincoln interest with my interest in the media, having been, as you mentioned, when I first got out of college more than 50 years ago, a reporter for a Manhattan weekly newspaper that covered politics intensely. And I was very interested in politics and government. I'd volunteered in Lyndon Johnson's campaign in 1964 as a teenager. Really, I was more interested in Robert Kennedy, who was running for Senate that year. And it was fun. I even got to meet Robert Kennedy on election night when he won the Senate seat. Yeah. So after a few years, a New York congresswoman who was fighting for her life politically, she had been redistricted after the census of 1970, asked me to become her press secretary. And this was 1975. And she had lost the Congress, come back to Congress, and now was going to run for the Senate. So at the age of 26 and 27, I got to be a political press secretary for a US Senate campaign and learned a ton, interacting with political reporters, advocating for a candidate. So I think in the space of 8 or 9 years, I saw political journalism, not presidential, but political from both sides. And then over the years, I got to talk about Lincoln with presidents, former and current presidents, all of whom, interestingly, Donald Trump is not the first to say, I'm just like Lincoln. They all think it in their heads. They all have a connection, which I think is actually healthy. I'd rather they aspire to be Lincoln than to be Millard Fillmore or Andrew Johnson. And so I got to talk about Lincoln with them, and invariably the subject turned to the press and the way the press treats them. And that's what gave me the idea. After the Lincoln book won a few awards, I thought, why not look back and why not look ahead at the way the press and the presidents have interacted? So that's a long answer, but that's how I brought both personal experience and the experience of my last book to pull this off.
And we're talking about the presidents versus the press. You don't hit every president, but you sort of hit the highlights and major advances forward in this very complicated relationship.
Or backward.
Yeah, or backward, yeah, as the case might be. And I think those are some pretty interesting questions that you raise throughout the book is, as this relationship grows and expands and contracts and changes through technology, there's always that question of where it's going to go and how it's going to serve or disserve the American public.
And one thing that's consistent throughout is that people are always sure, beginning in the 1790s, they're sure that the press criticism of the president spells the end of civilization, the end of the republic, the end of civility. And it never does. We move forward, we survive, we emerge with a new relationship, and as you point out, new technologies. Although I always, when journalists have asked me since the book came out, or interviewers, isn't this a totally new thing? You can't compare the use and abuse of Twitter to the colonial period when George Washington was worried about newspapers that came out once or twice a week and was insulted when they criticized him. And the answer is, to the people in the 1790s, twice weekly newspapers were really breathtakingly modern, unbelievably accessible. And to read something poisonous about the president in the, Gazette of the United States or the Philadelphia Aurora was as shocking as some of us find some of the tweets of President Trump, or some of us find the tough questioning by MSNBC or CNN. So I think it's always been new and emerging technologies, and always been the good presidents are the ones that deal with the press in as friendly a manner as they can, and as open and accessible a manner as they can. But also, the best of the presidents have been the ones who have found alternative means to get to the public, kind of around the press. And that's, historically, that goes back to Lincoln.
And you talk a lot about the way they use technology to make those sorts of end runs, and that really redefines the presidency over and over because of
Right.
that new reach.
And I think in a way, well, when George Washington called in a Philadelphia editor and said, I've written a farewell address, would you print it? The guy, I'm sure, almost passed out. He was so excited that he was going to get this scoop, which he had it as an exclusive for maybe half a day, and then everybody reprinted it. But he was smart. He said, can I keep the original? And George Washington said, sure. He didn't care about the original, he cared about the publication. That was breathtakingly modern in 1796. So Lincoln adapted to a technology that had been around for more than a decade, the telegraph. How did he do it? Well, one thing they did is the telegraph was seized by the federal government. So no disobliging news could be published at a certain point over the telegraph wires. The telegraph office was located in the Secretary of War's waiting room. So it was a little inhibiting for journalists to file anti-Lincoln stories. I apologize if you hear the lawnmower. We're in the suburbs of New York, so lawnmowers are inevitable. And then Lincoln used the telegraph himself at the end of the war, when he was traveling with Grant's army, to send dispatches ostensibly to the Secretary of War, which were then republished verbatim in the nation's newspapers. So he, in effect, at the end of the war, was not only commander-in-chief, but war correspondent-in-chief. He wanted to be the one to bring the good news of the capture of Petersburg and Richmond to the American public, and he did. And then just, FDR famously used the fireside chat to speak directly to the people, even though he had a pretty compliant White House press corps that not only was affectionate toward him, but hid the truth of his disability for 12 years. And Kennedy used televised news conferences as his end run. The reporters really did not like that until they realized they were getting a lot of airtime on television and becoming pretty famous. Then they started liking it. And Barack Obama introduced the White House website. The reporters did not like being referred to the White House website, but think of it, Barack Obama has more Twitter followers than anyone in the world. However, Twitter is definitely the medium that Donald Trump has mastered. And I'm not sure he would have been elected or maintained his base without Twitter, because he not only uses it to create his own message, but to create his own news cycle. Every time he tweets, the broadcasters, cable commentators spend half a day discussing, dissecting his tweets. So he kind of masterfully, like or hate the message, he masterfully dominates the news with with his alternative technology.
Let me back up to something you said just a moment ago about how the press pool hid FDR's disability. And you talk a lot about kind of an informal, almost friendly relationship that FDR has because he brings people into the office off the record, has these backgrounders, chats them up, they chat him up. And that serves him really well in a lot of interesting ways that maybe don't show up in print, but show up in what they choose to print.
Exactly. And Roosevelt, it should be remembered, did not have a good relationship with the newspaper's editors and publishers. They never gave him majority editorial support in any of his 4 elections. Not even in 1936 when he won 46 or 48 states. Not even during World War II when he was trying to mop up the war against Germany and Japan. They never supported him. He hated them and told the reporters he hated them. But they liked him. He was, as you say, 2 news conferences a week on average, 998 news conferences over 12 years. Although he eluded them and evaded them and punished them once in a while. Spoke, I mean, we know that Donald Trump sometimes says, that's a wise guy question. You're a very nasty person. Roosevelt would say, go stand in the corner and face the wall when he didn't like a question. But they liked him. They liked his courage. They liked his informality. They liked the fact that he joked with them before the news conferences began. And they did have a gentleman's agreement, both print and photographers, not to show him in a wheelchair, struggling to walk, or getting in and out of automobiles. That was the worst, because there is one film in 1944 of him speaking at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. And after the speech, he's put back in his car and sort of folds into the back seat like a rag doll. And they have to prop him up. And he would say, no pictures of me in the machine, boys, or getting in and out of the machine, as he called the car. And I've looked high and low for any kind of agreement or plea. I look back at the reminiscences of some of the photographers, and they just said, we didn't want to hurt him. He was trying his best. We didn't want to embarrass him. He was a nice man. Eventually, the White House intervened. During World War II, they would ban a photographer who tried to take a picture that they didn't like. They would rip the film out of the camera. But for 10 years, it was all just voluntary. And if a newbie in the photography corps aimed his camera at Roosevelt when he was struggling or sitting in the wheelchair, there was always someone to give him a knock and ruin the picture. That's how much they protected Roosevelt. It will never happen again. I'm absolutely sure.
And that seems a lot different than President Bush throwing up on the Japanese prime minister and then having that get run over and over and over again.
Yes, I don't know what would have happened if Roosevelt had thrown up, but Roosevelt was they also trended not to show him a lot smoking, which he did continually. He was out in his cigarette holder, which was a little fey for the period, very aristocratic. Yes, any miscue, whether it's, someone throwing a shoe at President Bush II, or Donald Trump mincing down the gangplank at West Point because they were so stupid they didn't put a banister there, or railing of any kind. That's going to be posited. That's going to be discussed. However, medical records are still protected. I mean, Donald Trump's medical records are not public. He had a one-pager during his first campaign that said he's the healthiest patient that his doctor had ever seen, which, a little strains credulity. It means that our ideal should be overweight and weekend exercise in a golf cart. That's not ideal. So, yeah, we still don't have all the goods on anybody, although Joe Biden has put out his version of his health records. It's still kind of cloaked.
Now, you also talk about how that relationship protected JFK, even LBJ with their personal indiscretions. But then LBJ's relationship starts to sour in a way that, really changes that relationship between the presidency and the press that Nixon then does not do any favors for.
With Kennedy, he had been a reporter after a fashion. he didn't know what to do after World War II. So he was a reporter in Nuremberg and post-war Germany. And he had met a lot of real, full-time journalists, and they became pals. He had journalist friends for life. He golfed with them. They hung out in the White House. They came to state dinners. I mean, we scream and object to Sean Hannity's being close to Donald Trump, but this is also a tradition. Dates back to Andrew Jackson. Presidents embrace journalists who are supportive of them. It should not really shock us as something that's out of the ordinary. And these journalists winked and smiled at Kennedy's, not only Kennedy's extramarital affairs in the White House, but also his own health problems. JFK had really serious health problems for a young man, and was taking a lot of medication. And some of the journalists knew this, but he was one of them, and they turned away. LBJ got a lot of benefit of the doubt from most of the press when he succeeded Kennedy. He had some scandals in 1964 that would have brought down other presidents, although it doesn't, he had one guy who gave him a free television set, one of his former Senate aides, and then one of his closest aides was arrested in a men's room soliciting sex from a man. And that was considered, horrific in 1964. But he had enough goodwill going into the election of 64 to survive it. It was the war that undid Johnson. And what the journalists felt was a credibility gap. The fact that he lied about everything, nothing could be trusted. Truth is the glue, as Gerald Ford once said. That's the most essential thing that relates to a president and also to a press secretary. I watched the current press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, have her briefings, and their rallies, their advocacy events. Press secretaries should tell what they know. If they can't talk about it, they should say, I can't talk about it. And they should say, if someone wants to know something, they should, and they don't have the information but think they can get it, they should say, I'll check with the White House. I'll check with the president. I'll check with the chief of staff. If you look back at briefings, and I've looked back at all of them that I could get on video, that's the norm. They're not political rallies. They should be about information. And we've lost that. That's one thing, I think there's no going back on technology and the competition and the hostility. That may be gone, or the natural suspicion, that may be gone. I think things would be better if we have a new president in January, if we go back to White House briefings that are briefings. I think that would actually serve a new president better, for the journalists to know they're getting information, even when they don't get the information. They just don't get cheerleading.
You refer to the relationship between the press and the president as, and I'll quote here, the most profound newsmaker-observer relationship in the world. And of course, a press secretary plays a key intermediary role in that. How do you think that relationship has changed in the last 20 or 30 years?
I really think that the main change has been the Trump press secretaries. From the first day when Sean Spicer had to go, he didn't have to, but he was told to go on TV and say that the inaugural crowd was the biggest in the history of the world. And it just set the tone for something other than information, which was what a good press secretary does. Go back to the press secretaries who worked for Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. They would either say, you have to go to the lawyers, I can't answer that question, or the president is not going to resign. They did not fight back. They were actually really professional, and that's why that team is considered one of the best sets of press secretaries ever. They all have good points and bad points. Stephen Early served the longest. He's considered the first presidential press secretary, serving FDR for his full term, his full 3 terms in 1 month. And he was brilliant at getting statements out if the president put them on the record, at preventing the press in the back row of those news conferences from leaving too soon. I was going to say too early. That would be a good pun, or bad pun, to get the scoops. He would lock them in virtually during those crowded Oval Office press conferences. That said, he was a racist. And he didn't allow a black reporter into those press conferences until 1944. 11 years it took for a black reporter, and early used the excuse that only daily newspapers could be credentialed. But he knew full well that the black press in this country was largely made up of weeklies that were highly influential in the black community. It was stupid. It was stupid of FDR to allow it, because he was busily converting black voters from the Lincoln Association with the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And he actually managed it, but it could have been a lot easier if he had courted the black press. It might have happened earlier. I think in 1932, in the midst of a depression that arguably was hurting African Americans more than white people, although obviously there was a lot of pain to go around. The black press, the black voters voted for Herbert Hoover, still for the party of Lincoln. In 36, Roosevelt broke through after 1 term. And then African Americans have been in the Democratic fold consistently. But by the way, why did Stephen Early do it? You know who his great uncle was?
No.
Jubal Early.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So there's a little emerging Civil War. Think of how close Franklin Roosevelt was to the Civil War. 70 years, closer than we are to Franklin Roosevelt. It's amazing to think about it. And of course, he was a big Civil War buff, collected Civil War naval prints, went to Gettysburg to light a memorial. I think it's called the Peace Memorial, on the fringes of the battlefield, read Civil War books, and he met in Gettysburg. He met one of the last surviving members of the U.S. colored troops. Even though they didn't fight at Gettysburg, he met one of those survivors who was 90-something.
We're talking with Harold Holzer about his new book, The Presidents versus the Press. Since you mentioned Civil War there, let me back up to Lincoln. And I'll put in a plug for your fantastic book about Lincoln and the power of the press. I really love that book. For folks who aren't familiar with it, it traces the careers of Lincoln and Stephen Douglas and how they used the press for their own political careers, while also following the careers of Bennett, Raymond, and Horace Greeley in New York, and then tying those threads all together. It's a wonderfully constructed book. I just love the sophisticated way you built that book.
I don't know if you've just heard, and nobody in the press called me about it. I'm sort of glad. I never even knew this. New York City's highest award for firefighters is called the James Gordon Bennett Award. I guess I never knew. Huh. And it's named for Bennett because he gave $1,000 in the 1850s to endow this prize. And I guess that was enough then. It was like $1 million gift, or at least, $200,000 gift. And finally, after all these years, someone decided to look up James Gordon Bennett and read that, his constant use of the N-word. He was anti-Semitic. He was, in favor of the Confederacy, breaking off and not annoying anybody. He was almost shut down by the Lincoln administration in 1861. He refused to fly an American flag after Sumter until a mob massed outside of his headquarters in Lower Manhattan. Then suddenly a newsboy was seen running through the streets and came back with a package under his arm, and then they put a flag out to stop from being burned. So the title of the award has been rescinded. And James Gordon Bennett, even though there's a statue of him in New York City, has been removed from history because he was a racist. It's strange.
Wow. Now, you talk about Lincoln's very combative attitude toward the press, persecuting editors, shutting presses down. But you're somewhat sympathetic about that. You talk about how, we have the benefit of hindsight to know how the Civil War turned out, and he
Exactly.
didn't.
He
And
did.
so he takes these steps to curtail the very, you say, the very liberties that make our government worth preserving. What sort of assessment do you finally give on that?
Well, I think even more so than in 2015 or 2014 when the Lincoln book came out. I think he overdid it. I think he overreached. But I think he didn't know. Again, he didn't know. He thought the war would be over at Bull Run. The end of Bull Run, not only is the war clearly going to continue, but he's got no more 90-day and 100-day volunteers. The people who signed on after Sumter were all being demobilized. And he's got to get them to re-up. And when Democratic papers, and remember, papers were all then either pro-Democratic or pro-Republican, pro-Lincoln or anti-Lincoln. When the pro-Democratic papers in the North begin saying, this is ridiculous, we lost hundreds of men at Bull Run, was considered really horrific battle at the time, although it pales, of course, in comparison to Antietam and the others in Shiloh. Lincoln thought that was a threat to the country. So not he at the time, but as his government, removed those papers from the post office, threw them off trains. Ultimately, some of the editors were threatened with a federal indictment for treason. Some were hauled out of bed and dragged to Washington for questioning. When some of those soldiers came back, they created mobs that threatened even New England newspapers, even Massachusetts. An editor was tarred and feathered in Haverhill, Massachusetts for urging against re-enlistment. Lincoln thought that if there were no enlistments, the Union would be dissolved. So he thought it was more important to stifle the guarantees of free speech as enunciated in the Bill of Rights than to lose the whole game, to lose the Constitution itself. And that was his calculation. Now it continued through the war in the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland particularly, but also, as I say, in Illinois, in Indiana, in New York, all through the war. Did he need to? Again, it's a guess, probably not. Did he need to arrest Clement Vallandigham in Ohio and put him on trial in front of a military tribunal and ban him to the Confederacy? It's kind of an overreach. Did he need to or did his army need to close the Democratic Chicago Times? No, I don't think so. But it had been Lincoln's nemesis for 10 years. I'm sure he loved it. And in fact, later in life, he said, I was never sure that going back on that order wasn't the wrong thing. Kind of a double negative. But I'm sure he got his jollies from it. So in the end, probably didn't have to, no way of knowing, and he took the course that he took to save the country.
You talk about papers were either pro-Lincoln or anti-Lincoln, and that reminds me of a passage you wrote about Andrew Jackson, which also sounds prescient about today, but you write of a time when Americans defined their political affiliations not by party label, but according to their visceral reactions to the dominant political figure of the age. And you could probably say that very same thing about today's politics, even though
Absolutely.
a passage about Jackson, it could have been a passage about Lincoln.
And think of the fact that Jackson was truly a revolutionary in some ways. He brought journalists to Washington. He appointed one editor postmaster general, another one comptroller of the currency. Postmaster General Amos Kendall thought, well, maybe the first thing I ought to do is ban anti-Jackson newspapers from the post office. This thing about using the post office and abusing the post office is also not new. It's a thread in American history. And yes, anti-Jackson press and pro-Jackson press, but in those days, the press was really rewarded by the party in power. It was not like giving Sean Hannity a special perch on the White House lawn for the convention acceptance, whatever that was, where he got a special little seat and everybody objected. Jackson not only he appointed journalists to Federal Post, he hired his favorite journalist to work in the White House, writing his speeches, writing his veto messages, preparing a campaign for his second term. And in those days, there was no US government printing office. So the party in power got to designate an official presidential organ, by which I mean a newspaper, be sure. And the organ, A, got the news first, and B, got government printing contracts to do the minutes of the House and the Senate, and to do official notices for the Army and the federal departments. They made a fortune if their guy was in office. And that continued through the Lincoln era. There was political parties taking charge of the minutes of the House and Senate before there was a congressional record.
Now, going through the book, it's a little heavier on the more modern presidents than it was on the earlier presidents. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Just more source material, your own personal connections to some of those stories?
It's a good question. I wanted to do the presidents with whom I thought readers would be most familiar. A book about all the presidents, and there are interesting stories to tell about many of them. I didn't think they'd want to read about Zachary Taylor or James Knox Polk. It's more of the same. It's more of the Jackson tradition. And but I did think that after Kennedy, people would want something about all the presidents that they grew up with. So I wanted to fulfill that desire, even though some are half chapters, like George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford get half chapters to move things along. And all of the stories have been extraordinary in recent times. I just thought it was familiarity. By the way, in my defense, one defense is I don't want to do a book for 30 years that had 2,000 pages. My publisher did not love the idea of a volume 1 and 2, and maybe 3. But I do deal with some of the presidents in transitions to presidents. So with Jackson, I did write a lot about John Quincy Adams, whose son and private secretary got into a physical fight in the Capitol Rotunda over an article and over crashing a Christmas party. J.Q.A. Jr. had to testify in Congress, and the newspaperman who punched him, blindsided him really, cold punched him, was exonerated. It was very political. And I write about McKinley and the rush to the Spanish-American War in the TR chapter. I thought I would get a little more blowback about that from reviewers, but I haven't. And then with Kennedy, I spoke a little bit about Truman and Eisenhower because both of them were very much alive in the Kennedy era. And I had to tell one of the great stories of the president and the press, and that's Harry Truman. And I had a new spin on it. So Harry Truman went to a concert, his daughter's Washington debut as a singer, and the music critic of the Washington Post eviscerated her the next day. And Truman actually sat down and wrote a letter saying, next time I see you, you will need a cold steak for your eye and a supporter below. And the critic didn't publish it, but another Washington newspaper got it. I mean, he leaked it. And, it never hurt Truman. They thought, what a guy defending his daughter. What people don't know is that, or most people, is that earlier that day, his press secretary, who he loved and whom he depended on, was a jokester. He put his head down on his desk and fell asleep. And everybody was joking about it, but he was dead. And Truman, I just think, was, off his gears. He was really upset, probably more upset that he lost his press secretary than his daughter had endured a lambasting at the hands of a music critic. And he was rudderless, and he just lashed out on his own. I don't think his press secretary would have allowed him to write that. But it's a great dad story, I think. And then Eisenhower does have the distinction of holding the first televised news conference, although he screwed it up. I mean, they chose a really bad room, an old room with a 30-foot ceiling in the executive office building. And it comes out and says, well, we're going to try this and see if it's really disruptive. Not the way Kennedy started. So I tried to get all the stories I could in there that I had left out. And I put Hoover in the Roosevelt chapter.
Right, right.
The way,
and FDR actually gets 2 chapters because his term of service is so long.
and you know, I wanted to recognize one of the other reasons I wrote the book, to circle back to what we were talking about, is that I've worked for the last 5 years as director of the Roosevelt House at Hunter College in New York City. It's a public policy institute, but it's located in the historic New York City home that FDR lived in with his family for 25 years when he wasn't at Hyde Park. This is where he ran his gubernatorial and presidential campaigns. It's where his transition was headquartered, in the library upstairs. It's where he recovered from polio. It's where his wife and mother had the big conference about whether she would leave him or stay in the marriage in order to preserve his political career. It's where he gave his first radio address from in front of a fireside, right in my building. So because of my really growing interest in Roosevelt, because of my position there, and the ambiance of the house, which is palpable. I mean, I have events in his little library where he ran his pre-presidency for 4 months after November 32, where he hired the first woman to be in his cabinet, where he planned the New Deal. And earlier, where he would be placed on the floor in the early 20s to spend 3 hours crawling so he could build up his upper body strength to the point where he could use braces and give a good impression of walking, which he really could never do, but came close to approximating walking for the newsreels. And also because he served, he was elected 4 times. I thought by that alone, he deserved 4 chapters because he was a Depression president and a war president. So that's my justification. Plus, I really enjoyed it. And there is a lot of material, you're right.
Fascinating guy. So before we wrap up here, you talk at the end about this changing relationship between the presidency and the press, and that right now we're at a crucial juncture. I really appreciate the very fundamental questions you ask, and you sort of leave us with this thought: like, is truth itself really the casualty here? The notion of objective truth, and that's something that Jefferson complained about. You talk about that early on, but right now we're kind of at this crucial moment. Where do you think we stand?
I think we stand the way we did in the age of Jefferson, defending press freedom, but not too sure we like the result. We're also in an era in which the pillars of state, both formal and informal, have been increasingly placed in disrepute. It didn't start with Donald Trump, but it's been accelerated by Trump. And if you look at what the American people have faith in right now, the military, the courts, the Congress, the president, the press, the post office, science, the CDC, the NIH, and up and down the line, everything's been fractured and made into a partisan issue. That's never happened before. The military, did I mention the military? Half of the people don't believe in the military anymore because we have a leader who disparages both the generals and the prisoners of war and the volunteers and the draftees and the casualties. But that's an ugly situation. I don't know if we're ever going to agree on objective truth again. It does harken back to the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian eras when there was a partisan divide about what was real and what was not. So my hope is that when we return to an era of less partisanship in our daily lives, whether that's January 2021 or January 2025, obviously the jury is still out, that somehow we'll settle into more respect for objective truth, whether it's about vaccines or political honesty. But there are always going to be charges of fake news. There's always going to be partisan news. And I think we just have to grow up and accept it and choose our sources, our reliable sources, with care.
Very good. One
But
final
I hope I haven't been too partisan. But I
one
think
of the things I really admired about the book is you managed to avoid all of those landmines, because we all have opinions about the last few presidents, and yours did not come through. I thought you handled everybody quite fairly.
And, you know, I've enjoyed talking to some presidents about the press. I put all that in there. President Bush and President Clinton have both talked to me about the press, both for the book and previously when they thought I wasn't writing a book, but that's life. You know, they've had their problems, but they got past it, and the presidency got past it, and the people got past it. Maybe one trick I'd recommend is, as we choose our cable news coverage, why don't we require that they be more honest about what their mission is? In the Lincoln era, the New York Times was created. Its original circular said, "We will be a Republican newspaper fighting for the Republican cause." The New York Herald said, "We will be a Democratic newspaper. No allegiance to Andrew Jackson, but we will be a Democratic newspaper." And that was the style until the 1890s. It's the style again, but no one says so. Both Fox and MSNBC say we're the fair ones, we're the judicious ones, we're the nonpartisan ones. That's palpably not true. Well, why don't we label them with a little more honesty? You know, truth, we need truth from both the press side and the presidential side. And neither one is without blame for the current culture.
Do you think that consumers of news also are complicit in that?
Well, I don't castigate the press, the public, for consuming the platforms that they're most comfortable with. I don't expect progressives to turn to Laura Ingraham or conservatives to turn to my friend Chris Cuomo. And I say my friend because I've known him since he was a kid. He was a little boy when I worked for his father. He was a young student at a military academy, no less. Skinny little kid. You wouldn't think of it. But yeah, so I think consumers can choose what they want. I would recommend they occasionally look at something they're not comfortable with, because if you get too excited about what you're hearing on MSNBC and thinking the world is changing, you might want to look at see what Fox, which is still the highest rated network, is saying. It's pretty different, with some rare exceptions on the air. And I think there are reporters on both sides who try to be fair. Brian Williams tries to be a straight shooter. Chris Wallace tries to be a straight shooter. But by the way, if you want to just see it roll out the way it's happening, just watch C-SPAN. That's what I do.
Yeah, right. And as did Ronald Reagan, his addiction for C-SPAN.
So interesting. I'm glad do we have a second to talk about that?
Yeah, sure.
So we know from the first Bob Woodward book, or the most recent Bob Woodward book, that Donald Trump spends a lot of his time either in his hallway, where Teddy Roosevelt used to have his press conferences, by the way, while he was being shaved, watching big screens were tuned to Fox News, or he runs up to the private quarters, and at night he watches Fox News, and in the morning he watches Fox News, Fox and Friends. Ronald Reagan, and you wouldn't think this, was a C-SPAN junkie. Washington had just been wired for some kind of satellite, so even before cable, C-SPAN was available in the White House. And he used to go up and watch. Two interesting stories. Once, he had done an event with young people, and he didn't like something he said. Don't underestimate Ronald Reagan for knowing what was going on in his first term, and he was a master communicator. He didn't like something he'd said about making law, that the courts make law, not just lawmakers. He didn't think he explained it properly. And he went upstairs and noticed that these students who were watching him, who had been at the White House, had gone over to a different place and were regurgitating the event with Brian Lamb of C-SPAN. So, and they were doing a call-in. So he called in, and Brian Lamb was told, pick up line 3, pick up line 3, hold on for the president. He said, I'm just watching what you're doing, and I just wanted to say, let me be a little more clear. And that's from watching C-SPAN. Now, Newt Gingrich told me, I interviewed him for the book, that they were so onto Reagan's habitual C-SPAN watching that they would do, and also maybe his attention span was lagging a bit, that they would do 1-minute speeches from the House floor, which was broadcast on C-SPAN. And they would introduce legislative ideas, that weren't being considered for a bill, just as a speech. Reagan would pick up on it and go down and tell his advisors, I just heard this interesting idea. Once Gingrich did a 1-minute speech defending Nancy Reagan against charges that she was a nut for having an astrologer. And Reagan not only saw it, he called up Gingrich and said, thank you for what you said about Nancy. That was very nice of you. So he had a credit with Ronald Reagan. So it's very interesting. Again, it's not new. Abraham Lincoln used to read the newspapers, from cover to cover until he ran out of the time of day to do it. He was just a newspaper junkie of the first order.
So before we finish, I just want to ask one final question. Since the anniversary of Antietam is upon us, that opens things up for the Emancipation Proclamation, and your book about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, fantastic. We've had a tumultuous summer with a lot of attention on racial justice. So with the Emancipation Proclamation's anniversary upon us, any thoughts that you think we should kind of keep in mind this year?
I hate to see Lincoln and the proclamation taken out of context. I think some of the things he said around the time of issuing the proclamation or just before Antietam indicate that he had a narrow vision for it, and that he accompanied it with kind of obnoxious recommendations that free African Americans consider relocating to the Caribbean or to Liberia. I think you have to go back and look at the newspapers of the time to see how revolutionary the proclamation was. It may have been long in the making. Abolitionists may have been there first with the idea, but it took the country's breath away. It inspired or incited vicious blowback by the Democratic and Southern press. And Lincoln knew it was the act that he would be remembered for. And I just think James McPherson, who wrote a book about the Battle of Antietam, arguing that it was the most important Civil War engagement because it produced the proclamation, once warned that readers and historians ought not to look at history through the wrong end of a telescope. Our values now, our judgments now, are not the values and judgments of the vast majority of certainly white people in 1862. I think Lincoln was heroic and brave and gutsy to do what he did right before a congressional election. And that also the proclamation for him represented not only a Union-saving war measure, which is what he said, but really a culmination of a lifetime of anti-slavery beliefs, legislation he'd introduced in both Illinois and in Washington to ban slavery in the nation's capital. He finally got to do it, and it should never be forgotten that he did.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great reminder for us. We've been talking with Harold Holzer about his new book, The Presidents versus the Press. Harold, what a real privilege to speak with you today. Thank you so much for your time and for a wonderful book.
And a great pleasure to speak to you, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Thanks.